When I was teaching in universities in England, I wasn't very happy. English universities are not very happy places at the moment, and a lot of people who work there are keen to try and do other things. And I suppose that was the push factor, but that was really only part of it, because I had always wanted to be a writer. When I look back at my childhood, now I can see I was a little writer in the making. Of course, at the time that I was a child, I was so shy that I would never, ever have dreamt of doing anything so wonderful as to write a book. I thought books were so fabulous that they must be written by people who were also absolutely wonderful and marvellous and extraordinary. I knew that I was quite ordinary, and so I didn't think I would be able to write a book. I can see now that it seems a very childish attitude. It stayed with me for decades and decades, and I never quite had the confidence to admit to myself what it was I really, really most wanted to do. And it took me a lot of years of living to realize that books are utterly extraordinary, but writers actually are quite normal people. But once I made that realization, that was very liberating. Then, coinciding shortly after that with my growing unhappiness in my job, I began to think that I was a square peg in a round hole. I really loved my teaching, but goodness gracious, the admin that I was doing was soul-destroying. I began to think, no, I'm ready to do this now. I was so lucky in having my husband, who absolutely supported what I wanted to do, and he encouraged me to leave the university to set up a very small business where I worked part-time, and I taught French to people who wanted to move abroad, people who wanted to go to France and live there. And I met some lovely students that way. I really enjoyed my teaching, but because it was my own business, I was able to control the number of hours of teaching that I was undertaking, and that left me plenty of time to explore the writing. When I set out to write a book, I had no sense at the very beginning of what the structure of the book would be. I began with a character, not even a character, I began with a voice, and it was Miss Winter's voice. And I heard this voice very distinctly, and I followed the character, and gradually a person emerged around this voice, and then a story came from that. And the actual structure of the book, the double structure of events unraveling, unrolling, unfolding now, and the story in the past that's gradually discovered at the same time, that structure only came later on in the process. Now, once I realized that that was the structure I had to have, I was aghast. I was horrified, because I thought, well, goodness gracious, this is my first novel, and this is a very, very complicated structure for a first novel. If I had set out to write a particular kind of structure, I would have chosen to do something much more simple, because the fact that I'd chosen to write it in that way, with two narrators, with two different time scales, and the constant moving backwards and forwards between the two stories, made my life so difficult. I remember this, and my husband remembers it even more clearly than I do. At one stage, I was really tearing my hair out. I was desperately unhappy, really, trying to control my book and get it into some kind of shape, and I'd copied little extracts out on about 100 index cards, and I had them all over the living room floor, and I kept moving them about, trying to get my events to come out in the right order. And I had these tiny little pieces of card, and I thought, well, if I move that one to there, and if I have this event that comes after this one, but then if I do that, then obviously that can't happen there, because that can't happen before this. And it seemed to me that every single event that I wanted to twist and bring in just here, it meant that it made a hole somewhere else that had to be filled. And I thought, I'm really trying to do something impossible here. Should be my fourth novel or my fifth novel, and I'm just not good enough to do this yet. And I really felt as though I had wandered naively into something that was much more advanced than I was really capable of. And I think that is the main reason why it took me so long to write. The truth of the matter is that I did write it twice, because the first time it came out, the first time I got the story, but really it was so bitty, it seemed to jump, it wasn't comfortable to read, and I knew that I wanted to produce something which gave the impression of being a beautiful, seamless story where you would turn one page and turn one page more and turn another page, and you'd have this sense of moving seamlessly through the story, and I knew I hadn't achieved that. So I had to put the novel aside for a time and come back and really write the entire thing again, which is why it took as long as it did. It was very much like a jigsaw puzzle, and I kept thinking, the story is so clear in my mind, I can navigate between the story and I can find that everything does hang together logically in my mind, and why can't I make it seem like that on the page? And that sort of one word after one word, one page after one page, getting that movement right. I think it took me the whole of the second draft, which was 18 months. It took me 18 months to get that impression of smoothness. Miss Winter came first. I had been thinking about Patricia Highsmith's Ripley books, and in particular I was thinking about the kind of person who has an outer public appearance and an inner self that only they know the truth of, and which is entirely different. And I was just pondering really over how lonely a person like that must feel. And very suddenly, out of the blue, I heard this voice in my head, and I rushed home because I was in the park, and I rushed home and I said to my husband, I can't cook the dinner because I have to write this down. And I wrote very, very fast, and for a couple of hours, and I ended up with a piece. I didn't even know at that stage whether it was male or female, but it was Miss Winter. And a lot of that initial scribble did turn into the letter that she eventually sends to Margaret at the beginning of the book. And that was really the germ. Much later, gradually, her story appeared to me. And that was very much a case of working backwards, I would say. I had the sense of who she was as an old lady, but then I had to work back from there and think, well, why is she like this? What made her like this? And there's a gradual sense of peeling back the layers and going back into the past to try and see what must her story have been in order for her to end up as the woman she is when she's old. It felt like a process of discovery, not invention. Before I started writing, I often used to hear writers. I was always fascinated by hearing what other writers said about writing. And I often heard it said that people would, I often thought that people said it's more about discovery than invention. And I never quite knew what they meant. But once I was doing it myself, I realized, because you do have this sense of a real person and you are slowly getting to discover more about them. The big revelation about Miss Winter, which I won't mention what it is, was one that came to me when I was walking home from doing the grocery shopping, I think. I remember walking up a hill to come home with groceries in each hand, thinking how heavy they were, and then stopping suddenly in the pavement and thinking, my goodness, it was a shock, that real moment of truth, the eureka moment that I've given to Margaret at the end of the book when she really realizes what the secret is. I resisted it for a while. I thought, no, surely not. It can't be so. But it imposed itself, and I realized it was the only way it could be so. And then when I looked back at the pieces of the book I'd already written, I discovered, and this is the magic of writing really, I discovered that all the elements of what had come to me as a great surprise, all the elements were actually all in place. And that in fact, part of me must have known all along that this was Miss Winter's truth, because actually all the evidence was there in the book. And yet when it actually occurred to me, I was surprised. So that was Miss Winter. Margaret, my goodness, she was difficult. She was the most difficult of all the characters. She's such an excessively reserved person. It took me about 18 months to write the first draft of the book, and I felt that it was a failure, partly because it was put together in such a ragbag of bits and pieces, but also, and I can say this now, it was Margaret's fault. She turned her back on the reader all the way through the first draft, and getting Margaret to come out of her shell and encouraging her little by little to open herself up a little bit more to the reader and to me, that was one of the main jobs in the rewriting of the book. I can remember at one stage thinking, perhaps I should just make her autobiographical. Perhaps I'll just make her like me, and then it will be easy to write her. But I did resist that temptation, and I'm glad I did, because in the end, little by little, she did open up. I think probably the breakthrough that made that happen was my realization that she's writing this story after the events have already happened, and therefore everything she learns from Miss Winter and from Aurelius about friendship and the value of honesty and faith and opening up to people, she has already learned that when she comes to write the story. So she can present herself as that shy, reserved, closed, almost invisible person that she was when the events began. But at the same time, as she narrates it to the reader, she can actually open up and show her human side. A lot of the time with Hester, I found that I was just having to try to keep typing fast enough to keep up with her, and she seemed to take over the narrative and really push it forward. And I was struggling so hard with Margaret that it was enormously reassuring to have a character like Hester, who I felt I could really rely on to get things moving, to make things happen. She has such energy and drive and verve. She really took me over. I think I could have written an entire book about her without any trouble. In fact, I think she could have written the book, really. I'm really fond of Hester. Even her arrogance, I think, is rather touching in a way. I wouldn't expect everyone to think so, but she is rather arrogant. But really, when you think who she is and you think of the odds that were stacked against a talented, ambitious woman in that day and age, I think that her arrogance is rather forgivable. She knows she's special. She knows that no one else in the world is going to see her specialness unless she makes it absolutely clear. I just think that a gifted woman with limited acceptable channels for that talent and that ambition, I think that even in her failings, I think she's a touching character, and I'm fond of her. Some of the writing in the book that I'm happiest with is where I write about John the Dig and the Misses, writing about their relationship. They're not a couple in the traditional sense, and yet in every meaningful, real sense, they are a couple. Theirs is one of the quieter stories in the book, really, but I love him and I love the two of them. I think in many ways they're the heart of the book, and you need them. They have to be there as a counterbalance to all of the chaos and the neglect and the wickedness, the brutality of Charlie, and the madness, really, of Isabel.